sight to come into church and see all these twinkle lights. Anyway, a couple of announcements. Next Sunday is going to be a really amazing Sunday for us together. We're not even going to have church in the morning because what we're doing is so big it can't be contained to an hour. We're going to meet at noon and have worship in here, and then we're going to go and have a lunch together in the fellowship hall. Also, there is our bake sale, which we do every year for holidays, for Christmas. And then also it is going to be Advent by candlelight, our annual worship service for that. So, good deal. Yeah. So we'll see you all next Saturday. If you know anybody that from King of Glory, maybe you haven't seen them in a while, give them a call. Invite them to come. Tell them it's all hands on deck next week. And Sunday at noon. If you come at this time, you won't get in. You'll think to yourself, oh yeah, Pastor Tim told us we're having it at noon, so come back. All right. Also, we're collecting stuff for food pantry. There's a little blurb in the bottom of your sheet. With that, let us stand and join in our call to worship. Let us draw near to God.
Let us look down on the Spirit.
Let us open ourselves to God's Spirit.
Let us come again be filled.
Open our hearts to receive your love.
Make us a vessel of your love.
You may be seated. Before we read the gospel, because we're reading just a short section of it, I'm going to bring you up to speed on what happens in the first 3 chapters of Esther. You probably know this already. You've probably read it before. The main characters are, there is a king, and this was the king of Babylon. And then there was a guy named Haman, and Haman was the right hand of the king. I think the king couldn't remember his name, and he'd say, hey man. And it stuck, right? And then there was a woman named Vashti, who was the king's wife. And one day the king was having a party, and it said that the party lasted for 6 weeks. Lots of wine, apparently. And in a very happy state of mind, the king decided to ask his wife to dance for everyone. I'm sure she loved that. Actually, she said, no, I'm not going to do that. And she embarrassed him. And so he banished her from the kingdom. That's not what this story is really about. But then there was a bit of an event where all the women in the kingdom had to show up. All of the young women, the women without husbands, and they had to prance in front of the king, and the king would choose the one that he wanted for a new wife. And apparently one that would be more amenable to dancing before drunken men, apparently. And so, of all of the people, all of the women, Esther was chosen, and she was Jewish. And she was being raised by her uncle, Mordecai. And Mordecai got into it with Haman. And Haman decided to teach him a lesson. And to do that, he was going to get the king to pass a decree that on a specific date in the future, all of the Jews were to no longer be protected. In other words, you could take their stuff, you could treat them poorly and worse. And so the king signed this, because the king didn't know what was going on most of the time. And all of a sudden, all of the Jews are hearing about this. And that's where our scripture begins. So come on up here.
Today's reading is from the 4th chapter of Esther. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went through the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province, wherever the king's command and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, so that he may take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hadach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend to her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why. Hadach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king and make supplication to him, and entreat him to her people. Hadach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hadach and gave him a message from Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come to the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than in all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Here ends the reading.
Thank you. That was long, but so Esther finds out the plan that Haman had to give the king lots of money to destroy the Jews. And so Esther is asked by Mordecai to go into the king's chamber and tell him not to do this, not to follow through. And so she does. She comes into the king's chamber, and he holds the golden scepter out to her, which means she's not going to die. The story ends in quite an amazing fashion. Mordecai overhears, I guess while he's in sackcloth and ashes, he overhears a plot by 2 of the king's servants to kill the king. And so he gives word to Esther to tell the king that his life is in danger. And then the king realizes that Mordecai was faithful to him and spared his life. And so he plans a big banquet in Mordecai's honor. And he tells Haman that there's going to be a big banquet in somebody's honor. And Haman, of course, thinks it's going to be in his honor. And so he makes all these preparations, and then at the end he finds out it's Mordecai who's going to do this. And Mordecai tells the king what Haman has been up to, and then they cut Mordecai's head off and put it on a stake, or Haman's head off. So it's called apocalyptic literature. It is written and read by people who are oppressed. The Jews were oppressed in Babylon. They were enslaved against their will. They'd been robbed and taken of all their stuff, all their property, and moved from their land. And so these kind of tales where good wins over evil at all costs and miraculous twists of fate are part of the story. I want to focus a little bit on this story. On one part of it that they put on sackcloth and ashes. Now this is a desert climate. Imagine in the heat of the summer taking and putting on a burlap bag and covering yourself in ashes. That sounds itchy and uncomfortable. And they would do that because they were trying to move pity in people or the king. So they found out that they were all going to die, and their reaction was to band together, to make themselves vulnerable, to put on sackcloth and ashes. An easy target. And so eventually when Esther, she concocts this plan and she says, I'm going to go in and see the king, and she wants all the Jews in the whole country to fast for 3 days. And so they do. All right. Why would you do all this? I guess some people might think that you're trying to get the king to feel sorry for you and to make another decision, to manipulate the king. The king doesn't seem too bright, so I don't know how well that would work. But do we ever see that today? Not with the king, we don't have a king, but with God. Do you think people sometimes try to manipulate God when things aren't going well? Some kind of a diagnosis of health. People decide they want a miracle, and so they fall prey to any number of televangelists who will tell you, if you just put your hand on the radio and your other hand on your wallet, we're going to say a prayer together. I don't know. I think it's human nature to do whatever you can, and to see God as the one who potentially holds the power to change your life. Maybe there's some plan that God has, and by doing the right kinds of things, maybe you can get God to make a better outcome. I think that happens all the time. Last week, the sermon that I gave was about God's uncontrolling love. And if God's nature is one of uncontrolling love, then God can't fix everything without help. God can't unilaterally decide something's going to be different and make it happen. Now, apparently that made a lot of people uncomfortable, which maybe that's good. Maybe once in a while we should make people uncomfortable. I had somebody come up to me and said, well, Pastor, if God can't affect my life, why should I bother to pray? What's the point? I thought, well, that's a good question. I'm going to have to think about that for a little bit. Actually, I've been thinking about that for a long time. This is an example of what I was saying about trying to manipulate God. If you pray the right way, or if you have a prayer chain with enough people on it, or if you all pray the same prayer. Years ago, there was this prayer called the Prayer of Jabez, and it was a prayer from the Old Testament where somebody prayed this prayer, and then their area, their fields, their lands were expanded by God. And so some, again, huckster decided he was going to sell, and he sold over 1 million copies of this book to Christians in the United States of how you can manipulate God by saying this particular prayer. And people bought it like crazy. I remember hearing about that and thinking, oh, this can't work. There's no way. But some people, they claimed, yes, I did this and I won the lottery, and I did this and all of a sudden somebody gave me a big chunk of land. I don't know if it was true or not. It could have just happened anyway. So what is prayer? What is prayer if it's not manipulation? Right? Because we don't really want to think about manipulating God. What if we are in prayer aligning ourselves with what God is doing? Or aligning ourselves with each other? Oftentimes people call me and say, Pastor, I'm going in on Friday for a test. Will you pray for me? And I usually say, well, can I come and pray with you? And if that's not possible, sometimes they go, oh, no, I don't need that. I just need you to pray for me. Because, and I think, maybe they think that I am so great as a pastor that my praying is going to change the outcome of the test. I wish it were so. Years ago at Hales Corners Care Center, when I was a hospice chaplain, I prayed for a guy who was dying. Well, actually, I didn't even pray for him. I was just with him while he was there. And all of a sudden he woke up and said, how does a guy get a sandwich around here? And then he lived for another 6 weeks, and everybody thought it was a miracle, that I must have said some prayer. They wanted to know what I said. And whenever I walked into Hales Corner Care Center to see one of our members, the nurses all kind of looked at me like, ooh, Who are you here to see? It's not how it works. If you call and ask me to pray with you, it is a way for me to show that I'm with you, that I care about what's happening to you. And we will share the burden, which will make it a little bit lighter, the fear. Now, is that to say that it's useless to pray to God about a test? Not at all. I think God has the power, the ability to heal people. But God always, in all instances, wants the very best for all of us. It's not like all of a sudden we've prayed the prayer, now God can get in there and act. God is always trying, working through the circumstances. So what does prayer do? Well, prayer opens up new avenues of hope and hopefulness for people. When you align yourself with what God is doing in your life, and especially, you bring people into this, and we're all sort of in this together, it opens up new avenues, because God is not going to control things, but we're inviting God into the midst of this situation to do whatever God can do. And sometimes it's exactly what is needed. There was a study years ago about people of faith and people who believed in God and had a cancer diagnosis, and they had a strong support group, and they had a prayer chain. And the results were that 40% better results for those people than the people who were alone, who had no faith, who had no hope. Well, what does that mean? Did God supernaturally make, in 40% of those cases, them better? Or was it that everything was working together in the best possible way that it could? Sometimes people aren't healed. And if you believe that God could have healed them and didn't, what does that say about God? Well, I'll tell you what people say. Sometimes they will say, well, you didn't have enough faith. Or maybe there weren't enough people praying. Or maybe you prayed for the wrong thing. Or maybe. Maybe God is trying to teach you a lesson. Maybe there's something better waiting for you after. You just don't see it yet. And then when none of those things seem to work, they just say, well, it's a mystery. Mordecai and Esther got everybody to fast together, to give them resolve and to give Esther courage. When she saw what everyone was doing, she knew she could do her part. When we come together as a congregation and we are together, our numbers get a little smaller every year. But I think that there's so much good that comes when we get together and we stand with each other and for each other. And God is with us. God stands with us and works in us and through us to bring about the world that God wants. We participate with God in that a peaceful world for all people. And we wait for that to happen, and we participate. We know that God is coming, and coming in us. Amen.
Amen.